Hamstring strains are the worst, aren't they? Especially when they keep coming back. It's like, I stretched, I went to physio, but now it's back. My name's Kurt. I'm a physical therapist. I just want you to feel better. So we're gonna look at why hamstring strains typically happen, what you can do that's more than stretching. Let's get to it. First, we gotta learn some anatomy, don't we? So this is the Visual Anatomy app. We found one that I can use for longer than 10 seconds. I want you to see your hip flexors, your hamstrings, how they work together on the same leg, and also how they work together on the opposite leg, specifically when you're striding, when you're running. So with anatomy, you care about where something begins and where something ends. Those two anchor points are called the origin and the insertion. And what matters about that is where it originates and where it inserts determines what it's moving or what it has the ability to move. So we think about the insertion as the only thing that moves, but the origin can also move if the insertion is locked down. You kind of follow that? It's like I can lift my knees up to my chest, that's the insertion moving, or I can squat my butt down, that's the origin moving. They're both using my hip flexors, but the one side's moving versus the other side's moving, which will make sense in like 2 minutes. So let's bear down for 2 minutes. You got this? As you can see right here, this is your psoas major. Your psoas major and your iliacus combine to make your iliopsoas. You've heard of that before, right? It connects to the front of the femur bone, and if it connects to the front, it moves it to the front. So look at it here from the side. Your iliopsoas is right there. And you can start to see when that pulls, it's going to pull your hip up. It's going to flex the hip. And that's why it's called the hip flexor. More specifically for those with back pain, but it's good for you to still see where it originates from. This is your psoas. See how it connects all the way up into your spine. Specifically, look at origination, the origin, T12 to L5. Transverse process. Transverse is the side. Process is just a bump. So the outside bump is where the right, this is the right side, the right psoas major originates, and it goes all the way down to the lesser trochanter of the femur. So it goes from back to hip. Cool? So why do we care about that? Because they're your iliopsoas. They can move your back, more specifically the psoas. That's why you've heard of psoas stretches. The psoas can move your back if the origin is moving. That's where we get like anterior pelvic tilt and sway back and all those posture things. So as you look to the back of the leg now, your hamstrings, you have hamstring strain, you obviously care about your hamstrings. Your hamstrings are actually 3 muscles. Your biceps femoris, I'm flipping you off, sorry. Your semitendinosus and your semimembranosus. Right here, you have your biceps femoris, you have your semitendinosus, and the semimembranosus is underneath the semitendinosus. So we have it here on the right leg, the semimembranosus. Those 3 combine to make your hamstrings. Notice how the semimembranosus goes to the inside of the knee, the semitendinosus goes to the inside of the knee, the biceps femoris goes to the outside of the knee. That doesn't specifically matter for you, but some people have hamstring strains on the inside of the knee. It's actually a hamstring issue, like where you got your kneecap, you got a little bit to the inside of your kneecap on your tibia. That's like where your hamstring tendons connect. So we have to look at hamstring pain, not always knee pain. But majority of people who have hamstring strains are either in the middle, in the muscle belly, or up as it connects up. Let me select semimem, as it connects to the tuberosity, your ischial tuberosity, those are your sit bones. Now, hamstrings can either move your hip backwards or they can bend your knee up. Most often when you get injured, it's when you're trying to do both. When your foot's in front of you, looking right here, your foot's in front of you, your hip is trying to go backwards to pull the ground underneath you in order to progress your body forward, as well as your knees trying to do the same thing. So the hamstrings are working at the butt and they're working at the knee. So they're loaded a lot, especially if your trunk is not in a great angle and the hip flexor on the opposite side. So on this one, the right hip flexor, if that's tight, it's going to alter where your pelvis is. So the hamstrings could be preloaded or overloaded prematurely, which we'll get to in just a second. So I want you to see hip extension down here in the bottom. Can you see how the hamstrings pull from the pelvis? The pelvis is stationary, and it pulls through the knee in order to drive the hip backwards. This is all in what we call open chain, where the foot's moving and the hip is staying stationary, or the pelvis is staying stationary. So as that foot goes forward and it has to pull under, the hamstrings are pulling that by pulling on the pelvis. So again, I'm going to repeat this just because we're going to get to it at the end. But if that pelvis is pulled in a certain direction because the front of the opposite leg is tight, it's going to prematurely load that hamstring. So as you're starting to pull through the window of running, the hamstring tendon up near the butt is saying, I can't do that because I'm already anterior tilted and I'm already pulled in that direction even before the foot tries to pull under. So as the foot goes in front of you, it's lengthening the hamstrings, and the hamstring's already lengthened at the butt. Again, we'll cover this right at the end. Hamstring's already lengthened at the butt. So that hamstring just doesn't have the strength and or length to handle that much pulling. And you'll understand this all at the end. I promise. I promise. You got it? Cool. This is why we like to understand anatomy. Hey, now that I think about it, let's go back to hip extension. Bear with me. Let's take a screenshot right here, right there. Draw on this. Zoom in. So you can see this, right? Can I see this? My light's in the way. Can you see how much reflection? There it is. You see that reflection? That's hard. That's hard to see. All right. Black's good. Yeah, black's good. So hamstring, connect to your pelvis, connect to your knee on the inside and the outside. These are your hamstrings. Go a little smaller. Your iliopsoas runs here. Cool? Now, if this is tight, imagine it's a spring. That spring is really tight, like it's like this, super tight coils, and it doesn't have this flexibility. What's going to happen? Your back's probably going to arch, and your hip's just not going to go back that far. Now this is, let me be clear, this is on the same leg. Cool? Do you follow that? Your hip extension is just going to be a little bit less because the hip flexor in the front is just not allowing that hip to go into extension. Make sense? Cool. But when we work on the opposite pelvis, that's going to alter the pelvis, but not specifically alter the hip because it's not in direct contact with the same hip. You good? The left hip flexor is not in contact with the right hip. Duh, right? It's on the left side. But the left hip flexor is in contact with the left pelvis, which is kind of pretty much fused. It's not fused because it does move, but it moves very little. It is in direct contact with the right pelvis. So left hip flexor in direct contact with the left pelvis, which is directly connected to the right pelvis. You good? So that right pelvis can alter the hamstring. Did we follow that little path? Are you on that journey with me? Let's try to make it make sense. Delete screenshot. I feel like I've slowly dropped down. My chair is like losing its like spring oil, whatever. So I just slowly drop day by day. There we go. Now we're back at the top. So zoomed into the bottom again. Your hip flexor, just its dotted line means it's on the other side. So it's a dotted line through there. It's going up into your pelvis. This is your back. So it's going through here, all the way through into the front of the, what is that called? The femur. The femur bone connected to the knee bone. So if this hip flexor's tight, it's actually going to pull this part of that pelvis. Let's get you a different color. It's going to pull this part of the pelvis in that direction. And because they're pretty much, you have your pubis and you have your SI joint, but those really move together. They're not fused. They do move. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they're fused. But the range of motion is much less than your hip bone. So it's going to also pull this one forward. So on this specific side, the left hip flexor on the left can pull your pelvis into what we call an anterior pelvic tilt, which pulls that right pelvis into an anterior pelvic tilt, which prematurely loads this part. Let's go a different color. this part of your hamstring. So hip flexor right here pulls the pelvis into an anterior pelvic tilt right there, which can load that hamstring prematurely. You follow that? Now, let's bring this all home, Kurt. Let's bring this all home. So when you look at hip flexion, ooh, that might be good. That might be good. Yeah, it's not great, but it's good. So let's go on a little story again. Let's go on a little journey. When you're running, this leg's going in front, correct? This leg's going behind. So just imagine this is back there. Good. Imagine that femur, that whole hip is behind the pelvis. So as this goes backwards, again, this hip flexor is going and it connects there. So it has to lengthen. Good. If that hip flexor is tight, that spring isn't going to lengthen very far. So as this hip goes behind you, we get that, this is a lot longer than 2 minutes. That hip flexor needs to lengthen. If it doesn't lengthen, it's going to pull that pelvis in that direction. Can you see how rather than your hip going backwards, your pelvis can start to rotate again in this direction, which will allow your hip to go backwards further, but it's not actually your hip going backwards, it's your pelvis and your back going forwards. Good, maybe? Yeah, okay. Yeah, really? Put a video of it. Let's put a video right here. As the hip goes behind you, your pelvis goes forward, which gives you more relative hip extension. Cool. Now your pelvis, can you follow all this? Can I draw on it more? Different color. So let's keep red. Red is pelvis. The pelvis is going forward, and your hip, now we're on the right side, we're over here. As this is going, that's a bad arrow, that's confusing. As this is going forward, as you're striding, and your knee is bent, don't get me wrong, your knee is bent, this is your foot. This is your foot. Give you a nice toenail. This is way too much drawing. Okay. You follow all this? So hip flexor, you got this. I don't gotta recap it again because we gotta speed this up. If your pelvis is going anterior, if this one is going forward, this one's going backwards. Everything rotates through the center. The center is right here. So when this rotates backwards, this rotates forward. That's an anterior pelvic tilt. The tighter this hip flexor is, the more this pelvis rotates forward on top and backwards on bottom. The more that pelvis rotates backwards on the bottom, the more this hamstring, this is actually your groin, but more this hamstring gets loaded prematurely. That's why it hurts when you're running. Do we follow this 20-minute journey? Hopefully it's like 3 minutes, 4 minutes for you. I don't know. Did we follow that journey? I hope so. I really hope so. Looking back at that now, it's like, oh, crazy drawing. Whatever. Hopefully you followed it. Is that enough? So hip flexor connects to the back, connects to the hip bone, alters the pelvis. When it's tight, pulls the pelvis forward. Hamstrings connected to the ischial tuberosity. There's 3 of them that goes down in the knee. It is a hip extender and a knee flexor. As the hip goes into flexion, starting as you contact the ground, the hip, we talked about this tiny bit, the hip has to go into flexion, but as you're contacting the ground, that's anchoring into the ground, it then starts to pull. And that's that initiation of the extension. That's why it hurts when it's in front of you, not so much when it's behind you, because it's really lengthened when it's in front of you. Yeah? And if the pelvis is rotated, it's lengthened even more. Cool? Yeah. So, how does this correlate to the exercises I want to give you? You need to strengthen, here it is, welcome home. You need to strengthen in that lengthened position, that pelvis lengthened position. Learning how to get your hamstring to be stronger as it's getting lengthened, and especially as it's lengthened and it wants to shorten. As it's in front of you and it contacts the ground and pulls you backwards. How do we get it stronger, lengthened in front of you? That's what the exercises you're going to get in this video are about. But if you need to remember one thing, strengthen while you're lengthening. Cool? 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 Okay. All right, that was a lot. That was a lot of info. What do we do about it? What do we do about it? Stretching's great. So many of you have probably done this stretch when you strain your hamstring, and it doesn't help. I want you to do this stretch instead. The stretch that looks at the opposite hip flexor and the injured hamstring, the bothersome hamstring. We're trying to pair the stretches together so you learn a little bit more about your pelvis position. Does that make sense? Specifically in this one, I want you to learn, where is my neutral pelvis? Now, when my knee drops and my pelvis kind of falls off the table, that's actually not a bad stretch either. That gets more of the groins. And if you do that, you want to make sure you keep your knee, the down knee, outside of your toes to keep the groin stretched. But ideally, if we're looking at hip flexors and hamstrings, you want to try to get your butt, the butt of the leg that is down, to be up as high as possible, so it's level with the other butt. And then you can start to look at posterior pelvic tilt here or anterior pelvic tilt here, trying to get the hip flexors when you posterior tilt, and anterior tilt gets the hamstrings more. You'll start to feel that. Why I like this is it does two things. It stretches two important muscles at the same time, and it gets you a little bit more aware of your pelvis. Like, how does my pelvis position affect the stretching that I'm feeling? If that's true, then it also affects how my pelvis works when I'm running and moving, exercising, and all the stuff. So this is the rip you in half hamstring quad stretch, because we're literally trying to rip your pelvis in half to get you as wide open as possible, so that when you stride open, you have that flexibility in your pelvis. Try to keep the pelvis level. The bottom knee doesn't have to be straight. The back knee, you don't have to bend. You can alter this stretch in so many different ways. Just explore, just figure out what feels good. Kind of move your pelvis side to side, move your pelvis up and down, so anterior tilt and posterior tilt. Bend the knee, straighten the knee of both legs. And you don't have to have a table like this. You can do it on a couch, you can do it on a bench, you can do it on an upright bench, you can do it on a random table, you can do it in your office chair, you can do it on an armchair, you can do it anywhere. Goal is just to try to support that pelvis and split you in half. So let's do this stretch rather than the other stretches. And then the most important part of hamstring strains and any rehab, lengthen and strengthen at the same time. So we're going to do strength training exercises at very low weight, even just body weight, with the goal of trying to lengthen that hamstring in the area that it bothers you. So when your trunk is going forward, when the knee is coming closer to your chest, when you're moving forward, how do we simulate those movements? We have lunges, we have split stance deadlifts. Both these are very similar exercises. One has a larger range of motion. One's more targeted for the upper hamstrings and the butt. So the reverse lunge is on a slider. This is a furniture slider on carpet. You can do socks on hardwood, socks on tile. Just get something slippery so you don't have to think about moving. 99% of my weight is on the front leg. The back leg's just there to slide. And when you're sliding, I want your shoulders to stay over your toes. This is a butt dominant lunge. Quad dominant lunges are not bad, but if we're looking at hamstrings, we want to get the hamstrings and the butt engaged. This is a quad dominant lunge. It actually gets the stretch in the back leg even more because your trunk's upright, but as you go down and as you come up, you'll feel the quads of the front leg even more. So I want your shoulders to be over the toes, and you're not rounding your back. You're really trying to arch your butt. What I say, you're a happy puppy dog. Your tail's up to the ceiling. Your tail's not falling between your legs. You're not tucking that butt under. You're trying to keep that back arched, the butt arched as much as possible. Continuing to get stronger and stronger as your butt goes down. As you lengthen out those hamstrings, you're getting stronger while it's lengthening. Way better than stretching. I say, strengthening is like a conversation, like, hey body, can I do this? Will you allow me to do this? Stretching is like an argument. Hey body, get more flexible. I need that to happen right now. Do it. But I don't want to. When you strengthen, it's a conversation that says to your body, let's try to do this. The more you do it, the stronger you get, the more you can do. Follow that. Split stance deadlifts. Same exact principle, just more hamstring and nerve dominant. Knee is slightly bent. Back leg is like 20% weight bearing. Front leg's like 80% weight bearing. Moving for you, I want you to just go to your knees. The weight goes down to your knees, trying to keep that back arch. Again, happy puppy dog, tail up to the ceiling, tailbone to the back of your head, tailbone up to the ceiling, like your sit bones, tailbone all the way up to the ceiling to the back of your head. As you're going down, don't allow that back to round, because then that loads the nerves a lot more, loads the discs a lot more. Sets and reps on all of these. Stretch for 30 seconds to a minute twice a day. Do lunges, do 15 twice a day. Do split stance deadlifts, 15 twice a day. As you get comfortable, you bump up the weight, you reduce the reps. If you need any more questions on that, just comment below, let me know. Sets and reps is a whole other conversation. And then the last thing is the classic, most like underrated, important hamstring strengthener of all time, Nordic hamstrings. Nordics are perfect for anyone who struggles with just hamstring strength as the body's lengthening. So there's two versions that I like for you specifically. With most hamstring strains, I like this version where we are engaging, you're slightly tilted forward, and then you're flexing at the hips, lengthening the hips at the pelvis, so that hamstring has to keep you stable as you're kissing the ground. Classic Nordics is your whole bodies, your shoulders and your hips are moving together. That gets the muscle belly. You are going to cramp. That's normal. Feet underneath the couch. If you have access to any sort of gym that has a Nordic machine, definitely use it. If you have a Smith rack machine at your gym, just use it. You need a sturdy object that your heels can push up into. As kids, we pushed up into our partner's hands, right? Nordics are so good for hamstrings. This is gross strength, just generalized strength to try to get your hamstrings more strong as they're lengthening. That's the moral of the story today when it comes to exercises. So quit that stretching and let's just get stronger. Get stronger as you're getting longer muscles. That's what we call mobility. This will help you with running. Now, if you have questions on like, what do I do before softball, before running, before exercise, whatever I want to do, and I'm worried about my hamstrings hurting, watch this video right here to figure out what is running form. How do I better use my body? What is running form? And then whenever I finish it, watch this video on exercises you can do to warm up, dynamically warm up your hamstrings, your hips, your quads, your core, your back prior to exercise. Dynamic warm up, not static stretching. Gets you ready.